right, everybody, I think we're going to get started with the next session. If you would be so kind as to grant your attention to the front of the room. Thank you so much for accommodating that request. You all, your stamina for this conference has been amazing. Stefania, thank you so much for keeping us on task and on schedule. Without further ado, I would just like to introduce Maria Friehs, who will talk about longitudinal intergroup contact effects and development.
Thank you very much, Linda. So, hello everyone, I'm Maria, and I realized this is the last session, and we've had 3 very exciting and full informative days of conference, and I also know there's dolphins outside. However, so I brought you one of very, some data I'm working with at the moment, and so that have been giving me some kind of troubles, and given the fact that now, a lot of the intergroup contact expertise and talent is aggregated in this room, I'm so incredibly grateful to present the data here, and I would really love to know what you think about that. So I'm talking today about longitudinal contact effects, and we know from the meta-analysis of Tom and Linda, but also from a few years later, that actually there's not so much longitudinal intergroup contact research. I've been just preparing or starting to do a review on literature on longitudinal intergroup contact since 1990. So this is far from being a full review, but the work in progress. Punchline would be that at the moment I identified 25 studies, of which most of them only included 2 waves of measurement, which is okay if we want to make sure that the independent variable is measured before the dependent variable, but which is not enough, for example, to check longitudinal mediation effects. For these, we would need 3 waves at least. And also for more sophisticated methods, looking, for example, at latent growth curves, we would need more than 2 waves of measurement. Also, we have seen that the applied data analysis is mostly based on regression. So we would usually have the dependent variable at time 2, and that would be predicted by the dependent variable at time 1. So we have the stability of attitudes, for example, and we would have the independent variable of interest, such as contact, and potentially a number of control variables in the regression. We have variance analytical procedures for differences in conditions and in experimental settings, for example, and we have some structure equation modeling, which increased during the last couple of years. So what are we looking at if we go for longitudinal intergroup contact data, or in general longitudinal data? I think we can think about longitudinal data as a kind of multi-level data, as depicted here, because we have a number of measurements, which would be the blue boxes over here, at different points in time, and they are all nested within individuals. And of course, in surveys, we usually have more than 1 participant, so we have actually to look at different kinds of variance and different kinds of sources of variance and explanation in our data. One would be differences between people, and these are differences that usually are quite stable over time. This is something you would find in every wave of measurement in there. But we also then have some kind of variation, some kind of process that is different within each person. As depicted here, for example, this kind of trajectory as responses to a contact or attitudes item, for example. And so if we handle highly frequent longitudinal data, thinking about diary studies or experience sampling, for example, we would usually go for this kind of multi-level approach, but actually in most other cases, we would not, as the literature review indicated. So it actually does make a difference whether we look at between-person differences or between-person variance and within-person variance. I brought you an example which, for a change, is not related to intergroup contact, which is an example taken by Hamaka. Oh, sorry, you should see her name. And we now have a look at the relation between typing speed on a computer keyboard and the number of typos we make. And if we have between-person differences, so this is now typical cross-sectional data, we might find this kind of negative relation, which indicates that people who type very, very fast also tend to commit less errors. So they would be the ones more proficient in typing. And those who type very slowly also tend to make a lot of mistakes. So what does it tell us? It actually shouldn't, and I think you all agree, it shouldn't tell us that if we want to apply it to the individual, we would recommend individuals to type faster than they usually do in order to commit less mistakes. What potentially happens is that this between-person variation can be explained by processes within the individual that are quite reversed. So here we would see in the gray circles, the process within the individual, which would actually be kind of positive relation. So the faster I have to type or I type, the more errors I make. So there can be quite different relations between different levels of analysis. We know that already. That was statistics or methods 1. That's called the Simpson's paradoxon. And however, this has been shown not for individual within and between individual effects, but for individual and context effects in intergroup contact literature as well. And I think we need to make sure in our literature that what we find and what we assume to find can generate from group processes to individual processes. Because if we don't assume our findings to apply to individual processes, why would we recommend intergroup contact interventions, for example? We would assume that an individual who has contact, who increases in contact, reduces in prejudice. And this has recently been called for as the kind of group to individual generalizability. And yeah, so most approaches we have used until now actually don't really make this distinction between person process differences and within person processes. It has been shown for latent growth curves, but also for cross-select panel models, that we actually need to change our model slightly in order to differentiate this kind of variance. And if we do, and if we compare conventional models to these more specified models, simulations found that in cross-select panel models, up to 95% of all effects in terms of their presence, their dominance, and their valence were biased, changed, missing whatsoever. So this is actually something I find quite interesting, and I find it's worth looking into. So based on the fact that most of the time regression-based analysis has been applied, I chose to go for cross-select panel models, which actually, extend the regression model I just explained to you slightly. We would have a kind of stability for our independent variables, such as contact, here over 4 waves, and we have this kind of stability for attitudes, attitudes at time 1, predicting them at time 2, 3, and 4. And in cross-select panel models, we're also interested in the cross-select effect. So does positive contact at time 1 predict attitudes at time 2, additionally to this stability in attitudes? Or do we maybe also have the reverse effect as attitudes, or do attitudes predict positive contact? If we now extend our model slightly, and now this is going to be a little bit complicated, I try to take you through the model. We extend the model in a way that we introduce this hierarchical structure. So what we do is we have these factors of attitudes and contact, and we separate them perfectly into 2 types of variances. The between-person variance, that's the green one over there. And these would be influences in our data which are very stable, time invariant over time. And Hammaker proposes to think about them as trait-like sorts of differences between people. Here we model the rank or the stability, which really remains the same all over time. So we only have this one between-person factor for positive contact and attitudes. And then what's not stable would be within an individual. So the rest is an within individual factor, and we would then try to model our stability and our cross-select effects within an individual. So I did that. I used the GESIS access panel. That is a representative longitudinal survey in Germany that was collected between mid-2016 and end 2017 for waves, with a 6 months interval between them. And the nice thing about this is that we have 4 subsamples in the data. So participants would answer questions to only one of 4 target groups, which would be refugees, Muslims, foreigners, or Sinti and Roma. And we have positive and negative intergroup contact items and attitudes in there. And I'm very sorry, obviously you don't really see all of my slides. That's not good. So that will be even more problematic in the next slide. I'm so sorry. Could we, so I have PDFs. Could we maybe show the PDFs?
Is it just that one item though?
No, it will. So then the next slide would be, or next slides would be. Yeah, okay. Then I just. Thank you. So there we go. Oh yeah, time for dolphins. Good, thank you. Is that? Yeah, brilliant, thank you.
Good.
No, it's not a movie. More time for dolphins still. So please keep going, yeah. Keep going. So this is actually also a kind of attention curve now. So what's happening? So, okay, I wanted to not show this at first, but well, now that it's there, let's go there. So we now go through one model because the results actually stay all the same and I'm quite limited in time. So we have the group of refugees as a model in here, and we see up in the top the conventional cross-like dependent model with a good model fit. So we would actually be able to, you know, use this model, and what we do find is like good and high stability coefficients, but also some kind of cross-select effects, which we would expect in both directions. So now if we introduce the random intersets, if we introduce the hierarchical structure in there, what actually happens is that in the process within people, almost everything disappears. So stability actually disappears. Also cross-select effects tend to disappear or tend not to be the same as in the models above. And what actually is consistent with contact theory would be this part. So now we go for stable interpersonal differences here, trait-like variance, and we would see that the rank order stability in intergroup contact is positively related to the rank order in attitudes, and negatively, so there's a negative association between negative contact and attitude. So that's what we might expect. We would also find a smaller positive relation between positive and negative contact. In some models, we don't find them. But this part we find consistently. The model fit of the model below is better, substantially better than above. And that's actually a pattern we can replicate for all 4 models. We don't really find the effects we assume to find anymore in the within-person level. So maybe we can continue. So these would be the Muslims. As an outgroup, same effect over there. Maybe you can continue, please. Sinti and Roma, the same effect there. Foreigners, there we have a little bit of a problem with the modeling. So this model is probably not reliable. Please don't pay attention to that. Maybe one more slide. So where does that lead us, or leave us really? So we can obviously observe substantial differences in conventional models and more recent models which introduce hierarchical structure in there, both in stability coefficient, but also in cross-leg coefficients. The reason probably why we don't see so much within person effects is the distribution of variance between person and within person factors. So what we see is that at least 50% of all variance in all models and whatever which factor actually goes to the attitudes, to the between person factors, up to 90% in some cases. So there is actually not much happening within a person, which we could then explain or predict. And these results are actually quite similar to other applications of the random intercept cross-leg panel model. Very good. I can do that without the slide. In other fields of research. So yeah, that's where I am now. I find that very challenging to interpret. From a theoretical perspective, I think we have to consider whether in a survey we would really expect to find processes within people, especially if we have a time lag of 6 months. But still, I think we would like to have some within person processes in general in intergroup contact research. However, I also find the between person variations interesting. That might lead to a new kind of thinking about intergroup contact research, because it very much directs us into trait-like stable differences between people who have contact and those who don't. Yeah, I'm quite convinced that further explorative work is needed to play a little bit more with these models, find out what this is about, really using other data sets, using other measures, using other groups and samples. But I really think it is important to consider these differences in our research, in our statistics, but also in theory, in predicting what we would expect in our papers. Thank you very much.
Wonderful work, and for any of us doing longitudinal work, this is just critical. One of the things that I want to ask you, or points I want to elaborate on, that I think all of us doing longitudinal work need to think about, is the time lag. So we're very obsessed with finding causality in the real world, which leads us, I think, often to analyze longitudinal data without actually considering theoretically what we would expect. Do we genuinely think a year ago having more contact relative to our general mean is going to have a sleeper effect a year later on attitudes? Is that what we're proposing? Or in fact, do we think maybe change in contact over a year co-occurs with change in attitudes? What do we theoretically expect? I think those models reveal that the sort of processes that we often test. So 6 months ago, something random happened and we wait for it to show up 6 months later while taking into account our mean. That doesn't appear to be there. But if we step away from this longitudinal obsession for a second, would we actually expect it? And I would love any comment from you on this.
Well, I think so thank you very much. I think your comment really addresses my general thoughts and opinion about that. If we want to, if we're interested in causality and we should not use longitudinal data, we're left with experiments practically, which we also do, or experience sampling, which then would also be kind of longitudinal, but using quite different approaches and methods. And so from what I've seen, experience sampling is not so much out there at the moment. So that would be a great way forward also for research. Also because it so much more digs into, what is happening? What are the people experiencing and feeling? Yeah.
Happens to me next week and so on. That fits very much with our theoretical understanding of how my contact might build and build and build over time.
Yeah.
I also like to talk, and I agree also with you, Fiona, but I think it's not only a question of the right time interval. So, but I also think we have to think more about when we expect dynamics. Yeah? So I think we have to go back to work in for example, developmental psychology, who discussed this issue many years ago. So there's a really good paper of Golub and Reichert, I think, from 1987, where they discussed this time interval issue, because we don't have any theory on this. And I think we always go into relatively into fields where all the dynamics already have happened. So we can't expect anything changing. So this doesn't really surprise me, even though I use cross-site panel modeling and showed whatever. Now I know it's wrong. Yeah, but I think that's really important. And so it's not only a statistical question we have to answer, it's a theoretical question.
So I see that there are so many more questions, and I'm just concerned about delaying our schedule further because I've been very well trained by this point of the conference. So for now, let's thank Maria, and hopefully you'll have a chance to talk more over lunch.